Well, good morning. I hope everybody's doing well today. We're going to go ahead and just jump right in here. Let's have a word of prayer real quick and ask God's blessing on our time together. We're going to be in James chapter 1, verses 5 to verse 8 this morning. So let's pray and then we'll get started here. Our dear Heavenly Father, we do thank you for this time that we can meet together. I know it's still that awkwardness of video and in person and trying to figure out what this is all going to look like. So I pray that you'll speak to our hearts this morning, that you will minister to our lives, help the book of James as we discuss the whole idea of wisdom. May that be meaningful to us, significant into our lives. I pray that you will just reach our hearts with who you are better through understanding that it is in our reverence, our fear, our awe of you, that in that moment that we would find that peace and harmony with how we live for you. So, Father, speak to us this morning, I pray, in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, well, we're in the book of James, and I know a couple weeks ago we've kind of had a little intro, and then a couple weeks ago we've had a little break here after last week. And I know 2 weeks ago I made the statement that life is hard. Oh boy, do we know, how well do we know that? And we all know it, right? It's not something new. It's not something that is a, wow, I never knew that before kind of a moment. So we just know it. There are trials, there's tribulations to endure. We've got sickness, we've got poverty, broken relationships, death. You just name it. There's things, jobs that get the best of us. There's jobs we get. There's jobs we lose. I don't mean to make it sound like all of life is just horrible, because it's really not. The reality is, though, that we have to suffer. It's a part of our life. It's a part of how we live. And James, as we are reminded, I want to remind us again where we started. James chapter 1 verses 2 to verse 4 says, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, into diverse temptations, knowing that the trying of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect," or mature, "and complete, lacking nothing." So this is why God allows trials and tribulations into our lives. It is to complete us, to mature us, to perfect us, so that we are complete, not in ourselves, but complete in our relationship with this way, with us and our Heavenly Father. And in becoming complete in that, we lack nothing. Now, that doesn't mean we won't ever want something or we won't need something, but God is coming to grips with the idea that God is sufficient to meet the needs of our life. And that's what really is significant. That's what really counts for us. And so we are to be thankful for these trials, count it all joy, for our trials and our testings, because they perfect and mature us. We are to be joyful in our sufferings, because at the end of it we find that we become complete. And with Christ as our companion, then we lack nothing. But still, I want us to know that in our trials, in our tribulations, and those of you that have had trials and tribulations recently, you understand, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is not easy. And so we still need that something to get us through that. And it's not an easy journey, but it still happens, and we move on then, if we do it the right way, with ease. Otherwise, we are battling constantly. And so we need help and a strategy to get us through these times, right? So for that, James will continue on here, and he reminds us that we need the wisdom of God to aid us in this. Nothing less will do. So let's go on and let's read verses 5 to verse 8, which are our text for this morning. It says, "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally, generously, and without reproach." He doesn't hold it against us that we need more wisdom. Whew, hallelujah, praise the Lord for that, right? "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him, let us, let me ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven, tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man and unstable in all his ways. Now, this wee passage, it is a bridge from this to the next section, which talks about our relationships, and our relationships that we're going to talk about are who we think we are versus who we really are, and then into the testing, the trials of life in the sense of being tempted, because we will fight battles of temptation, battles that are those temptations to do things that are wrong, things that could be potentially even evil, and definitely are evil in the sight of God. So this is that bridge from living the trials of life that are supposed to build us up and strengthen us, but then to take us on to where we live in our humanity. And so this is that bridge. And both of these things, the trials and the temptations, they beset our humanity. But William Barclay worded it this way in his commentary, and as you know, I'm not a huge fan always of William Barclay, but once in a while he says some things that I go, ooh, that is well said. And so he says this in his commentary on this particular passage of Scripture. He says, there is a close connection between this passage and what has gone before. James had told his readers that if they use all the testings all the testing experiences of life in the right way, they will emerge from them with unswerving constancy, which is the basis of all virtues. But immediately the question arises, where can I find the wisdom and understanding to use these testing experiences of this life? And he says, let him ask of God. And that's what James says here. This is kind of a summary of this bit from William Barclay. To say, listen, when it's all said and done, this is the foundation of living the Christian life. And in so doing, we have to ask God for the wisdom it takes to do that. Now, the things that help us get through these tough bits of life, it will come through wisdom, because we're not going to do it on our own. We can have a lot of knowledge, because knowledge is knowing the facts. Wisdom is knowing how to use those facts. And Warren Wiersbe, who you know I love to quote, he used a different phrase for that. He says, knowledge is the ability to take things apart, while wisdom is the ability to put them back together. Now, he didn't say who he was quoting, but I thought that was really good. Knowledge, the stuff we got in our head, is the ability to take things apart, but wisdom is knowing how to get all the parts back together again, right? And hopefully, I don't know about you, but I've done mechanicking things, and as I do mechanicking things, what I find is I end up with one little bolt, one little screw, one little washer, one little piece left over, and I got to go, ooh, where'd that supposed to go? And so real wisdom uses all the nuts, bolts, and pieces. So now James here, as we look at our scripture, James here now sets out for us that in our yielded state, as we yield our hearts to God, as we conform to his image, then James says in that we must find, first of all, to let patience, as he said in the first bit, let patience have its perfect work. And I'm not being overly patient because I've got a lot to say today, but I've got to slow down and I've got to think, what does patience look like in my life as it regards my relationship to God? And so James started out by saying, let patience have its perfect work. But now we see as well that as we are patient, we need wisdom to know how to live past this moment, past those trials, past those difficulties, past those things that God allows into our lives, so that in that moment we find that fullness, not only of joy, but of completeness, maturity, satisfaction in who Christ is. So for wisdom, James says, go to God, asking for something that we don't have on our own. If any man lacks wisdom, and all of us in our own way, we do lack wisdom. We need more wisdom. As wise as we think we are some days, we can always use a little bit more. And so he says, if you lack wisdom, if you need more wisdom, ask of God so that we don't have to do it on our own. So the first step is, of course, asking God. And second is, as we find there in verse 6, asking in faith. We need to have a believing heart. So we ask God and we ask in faith. All right, so James speaks of wisdom here as a start of this. If you lack wisdom, let us ask of God. And God gives to us generously, liberally, as much as we need. All right? And he doesn't hold it against us. Isn't that great? But we're going to talk about wisdom again. So I'm not going to make today an all-inclusive, here's the whole path of wisdom, because we'll come back to it again. And if you want to flip with me right back over to chapter 3, and we're going to look at verse 13 to verse 18, because this again is James dealing with the principle of wisdom. And he says, who is wise and understanding among you? Okay, those of you that have wisdom, what are you doing about it? Are you wise? Do we have wise in our midst? I think so. Let him show by good conduct that his works are done in the meekness of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. Because that kind of wisdom, this wisdom, he says in verse 15, does not descend from above. It does not come from God. It does not come from heaven. But it is earthly, sensual, even demonic. Wow. Ouch. For where envy and self-seeking exist, confusion and every evil thing are. But the wisdom that is from above is first pure, then it is peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. Now the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who make peace. Now, I don't know about you, but James, he puts it very bluntly in here, doesn't he? He says that wisdom is from God and evil is not from God. Evil is different. As we work through, again, as we look at these last couple verses here, 17 and 18, it is a reminder that as we work through the fruits of the Spirit, as we work through the Beatitudes, James is echoing the words of Jesus Christ, isn't he? He's echoing the words that Paul will later use in the book of Galatians, because as I've said, James was written most likely well before Galatians was written. But he's laying out some things, some principles of where goodness comes from. Wisdom that is from above is first pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy, and good fruits. The fruit of the Spirit is many of these things. So, the challenge for us is these are counter to our own natural humanity. And our humanity wants us to make it about us and not about godly wisdom lived out in humbleness. I want the world to recognize that I am something more than I really am. And I think that's probably true for all of us in our own way. Even those of us that think we have managed some sense of humility, we still have to battle daily that battle of to be humble, to be meek, to be conformed to God's image. And so, where do we come up with this wisdom? Well, James, as I said, there in verse 5, he says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. So as I ask God, and I say, God, I need wisdom in my life. Right? That should be our prayer. God, Lord, give me wisdom. Give me wisdom that reflects who God is. Give me wisdom that reflects who Jesus Christ is. That should be what we're asking for, all right? But how do we actually achieve it? Well, he says we're supposed to ask in faith, But why do we ask in faith? Well, I'm going to take us to Psalm 111 and verse 10. And there it says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, the word fear here is attached to several other words of what I would term maybe a similar flavor. Okay? And so when we see that word fear, the fear of the Lord, we can look at that and understand it means reverence. It means awesome or awestruck. It means we are afraid or exceedingly fearful. So the idea is that we start by realizing who God is. See, if we don't get who God is, we're not going to pray to Him asking for what we need in the right heart, the right attitude. We're going to ask it for our own use, and we'll get to that later in James, where he says, you ask and have not because you ask amiss, right? And you're asking for the wrong reasons. And so here we have to realize who God is. If we're going to go to the Lord in prayer, ask of God, because we need the wisdom. God, give me wisdom. If we're going to go to Him, we can't just go and say, God, give me wisdom. No, that's not what He's saying. We have to go to Him in this humility, this sense of the greatness of who God is. We have to come with an exaltation of who God is. We can't come in our own arrogance. We have to come in the presence of His righteousness that's been bestowed upon us by the presence of Jesus Christ in our hearts and lives. And that comes as we are in reverence and awe struck by who God is, that we are actually afraid. We really are fearful of what God could do to us if we abuse that relationship, right? Because He is creator, He is sustainer. Our lives are in His hand. Our lives are under His control. In other words, we have to come with a genuine, reverent fear that puts our lives, my life, has to be put into a perspective of who God is. See, if I don't get that right, I'm going to come to God in a false faith, in a false humility, in a false way that puts that relationship between God and myself, between God and yourself, into a false light, and then we're going to wonder, God, why aren't you answering my prayer? God, why aren't you giving me the wisdom that I need? So if we ask God, but we do it in such a way that lacks this reverence, this fear of God, then it's not going to work. Now I want to go to the book of Proverbs, and I'm not going to try and digest the whole of Proverbs this morning because we don't have time for that, but let's go to Proverbs, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and we're just going to look at the first bit here, all right? So bear with me here, because I'm going to do a lot of reading here, but I think it's significant because Proverbs is that book of wisdom. And I used to, there have been periods in my life where I have read a proverb a day. There's 31 of them. And so most months it works pretty good in the last day, whether it's the 28th or it's the 30th. You just read that last proverb just to finish up. So you've read the Proverbs every month. Try and do that for a year. If you do that, you'd be amazed with what you'll glean from it. So it's a book of wisdom. So if we were to ask wisdom in a heart of faith, we should come to it similar to what Solomon here says about it. So, all right, Proverbs chapter 1, verse 2, and we're going to read 2 to 6. It says, to know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning. A man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now verse 7 gives us this foundation that builds on Psalm 111 that we just read, right? Psalm 111, remember, verse 10 says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Well, here he goes on, he says the fear, verse 7 of chapter 1 of Proverbs, he says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. All right, what do we say? Knowledge is the ability to take things apart. Wisdom is the ability to put them back together again. And so he says, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. So Solomon here, see, he's tying wisdom back into our knowledge, because Solomon understands that with knowledge without wisdom is useless, but you can't have wisdom without knowing things. So it's tied together intrinsically here. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Now, do you want to be wise, or do you want to be a fool? Now, I know you guys would say too often, I act like a fool sometimes in some of the things I do, and we all do. But the reality is, my desire should be, and I'd like to think that I have a sense of, I want to be wise. I want to be wiser than I am. I need more wisdom than I have. And if you're echoing a different thought process, I'm not sure quite what to tell you, but you need to have that desire for wisdom. And we get it through the fear of the Lord, this understanding of the awesomeness of God that we come to in knowing who God is and knowing who we are in light of who God is. That as that works together, then we put it all together and gain knowledge. And in gaining knowledge, we also then have this desire for wisdom. We'll see where that goes here in just a second. All right? So this is that first bit, if you will. Now, I'm going to jump ahead here. As always, I encourage you to read the verses in between in this particular concept. All right, so Solomon now is going to personify or put a personality to wisdom. All right? So he says, wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses at the opening of the gates in the city. She speaks her words. Okay? So he's kind of making wisdom this woman, this glorious woman of something that you need. Now he's going to contrast that in another place to the wicked woman. But wisdom is the wise woman. Wisdom is the woman that we should desire, that we should seek after. All right? The other, the harlot, as you'll talk about later, is the woman we should avoid. That's the woman that leads us to evil, gets us into trouble. He says wisdom's going to keep you out of trouble. And wisdom is out there saying, hear my voice, listen to me. All right, so now here we go. She says to us, wisdom cries out, how long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? How long, you fools, you numpties, the saying is, we don't suffer fools gladly, right? How long will you fools, will you simple ones, will you love your foolishness, your stupidity, your numptiness-ishness? And he says, how long are you going to put up with this? When are you going to say, I want wisdom? He says, for scorners, still in verse 22, for scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Why do they hate it? Because it reveals their foolishness. Turn at my rebuke, cries out wisdom. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. Because I have called you and you refused, I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity. When your foolishness gets you in trouble, wisdom says, I'm going to laugh because you didn't listen to me. Verse 26 still, I will mock when your terror comes. When your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you. Wisdom says, if you don't listen to me, you get what you deserve. Wow, ouch. Solomon's almost as blunt as James is at times. All right, now let's go on to chapter 2. Again, read 28 to 33 of chapter 1 of Proverbs. Well worth your time, but verse 2 to verse 10 has this to say. My son, If you receive my words and treasure my commands within you, so that you incline your ear to wisdom and apply your heart to understanding, yes, if you cry out for discernment and lift up your voice for understanding, if you seek her, if you seek wisdom as silver and search for her as for hidden treasures, then you will understand the fear of the Lord. So, the beginning of wisdom is in the fear of the Lord. The beginning of knowledge is in the fear of the Lord. But as you learn knowledge and as you learn wisdom, you will fear the Lord even more. It's a growing process. It's like the snowball effect that we often talk about, where you're rolling a snowball, starts out small, and next thing you know, you've got a great big old ball if you've got enough snow in the yard, right? And so he says, you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. Verse 6, for the Lord gives wisdom from his mouth, come knowledge and understanding. He, the Lord again, stores up sound wisdom for the upright. He is a shield to those who walk uprightly. He guards the paths of justice and preserves the way of his saints. Any man lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all generously, abundantly. All right? Then, verse 9 in Proverbs 2, he goes on. He says, then you will understand righteousness and justice, equity, and every good path. When wisdom enters your heart and knowledge is pleasant to your soul. Discretion, verse 11 says, will preserve you. So this is the introduction to wisdom by Solomon. The whole book goes on and carries on, and Proverbs in its totality is to be understood as wisdom literature that can and should guide our lives and makes our lives then based on wisdom. So here in James chapter 1, we find then that the whole case is built on that we lack wisdom, and if we lack wisdom, and it's more of a because you lack wisdom, kind of an if there almost, I think I'm halfway fair in saying, because we lack wisdom, we should ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. If we come to God and say, God, I need wisdom, God will bestow that upon us. But there is a caveat here. Verse 6 goes on. And in verse 6 it says, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. We're to act with faith and with what we would call a believing heart that comes from a fear of the Lord, from a reverence for the Lord, for an awesome awestruck position in our relationship to God, all right? So that's how we're supposed to come. Knowing that the Lord, that God himself is sufficient. He is in himself sufficient to meet our needs for wisdom. He is sufficient to answer our request. So if we ask without faith, now here's the catch. If we ask without faith, it comes into a sense that we are like, as verse 7 puts, as he ends this verse, he says, you who doubt is like a wave of the sea driven and tossed by the wind. Now we understand what windstorms do. Scotland, we get a lot of windstorms, and we get a lot of waves on the down on the ocean, down on the coast. Even the North Sea, the picture of Bell Rock Lighthouse in the windstorm, where the wave is crashing up over Bell Rock, and it totally engulfs even the lighthouse that's out there. This is the storm that's driven. This is the storm that goes with no ease to anywhere. It's just boisterous, and it's bigger than we can imagine. And if we're going to stand in those trials, as we talked about in the first part of this book, we're going to have to be solid. We're going to have to be like that Bell Rock Lighthouse that has withstood the test of the storms, right? And the only way we can do that is if we ask God for wisdom in faith. Otherwise, we're just going to be beat and battered like all of the things that came before the Bell Rock Lighthouse. They stood out there, but they collapsed. They caved in. They were not reliable. Whereas the Bell Rock Lighthouse has withstood those storms. But if we don't ask God for faith, for wisdom in faith, trusting God, then we're going to be destroyed, and that's not what we want for our lives, are we? And so the storms will overwhelm us. They overwhelm things. They're everywhere but where we want them to be. They come, they go. They're not stable. They can be destructive, and that's our lives are going to be that way if we're not seeking wisdom by faith and trust in the sufficiency of God. Now, 7 and 8 will finish out this thought for us. This is the result of the tempest-tossed life. So today, the challenge for us is where do we fit? And verse 7 says, "For let that man, that doubting man, that man that is asking without faith, let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded and unstable in all his ways." Now, I don't want to be known as double-minded, and I don't want to be known as unstable. So I have to really work in my life to allow God to grow my faith, to trust Him, to be who He is. So today, as we ponder these thoughts, we've got to think about what should my response to this particular text be? What should my response to the fact that trials, temptations, but the trials, the tribulations of life are real, and we've got to live through them, but we have an answer to getting through them, getting past them, is found in the wisdom of God. Now, what's my response to that message? All right, what should our response be? And I think, first of all, it is that moment of seeing the testing that God allows in our lives. We have to recognize it is not God doing these things to it, but it is God allowing our world to have these effects upon us. And we're not going to like it. We're all challenged by it. We all see it. And we don't like it. We don't enjoy it. But out of it, the promise is that we will become mature, complete, and lacking nothing, because our sufficiency will be found in Jesus Christ, right? So that's the first part of it, is recognizing the trials and tribulations. Then recognizing that we don't have the answers. And in not having the answers, we have to seek the one that does have the answers. Then so we should seek wisdom in the fear of the Lord so that our lives are not tempest-tossed. That should be our first response. Asking in faith, believing that God can do what He says, that God can give us a generous measure, as He says here, liberally and without reproach. God gives it to us generously and does not fault us for coming to Him. He says, I've told you to come to me, so I'm not going to hold it against you that you did. He's going to sustain us in that. And so He gives us a generous measure of wisdom to know how to respond to and in our world and in our day-to-day living. So, here's the question. Do your testing times leave you questioning God? When you go through these tests, what is your response? Do you question God? Why are you doing this to me? Or are you saying, God, what do I need to learn from this? And I've got to confess, and I suspect you and I are not that much different, but we do find those moments in which we do question God and say, why? And I think probably that is fair enough. But knowing that and living through it in a wisdom-filled life are two different things, isn't it? So knowing that we will question God in that, but what our response to questioning God should be to say, God, work in my life so that as I struggle with this test, I turn to you and rely completely on your sufficiency to carry me through this trial, through this affliction. No matter what the outcome is, God can sustain us. He can give us wisdom to do that. And so the knowing the trial, recognizing the trial, and turning to God often are two different things. So What do you lack? This is the next question for us to ponder today. What do you lack to trust in God? And more often than not, I think the answer for us is wisdom. And so today, think about what do you lack to get through the trials that God allows in your life, and then ask Him for what you need. Okay? What do you lack to trust God? And then ask Him. And do it today. Do it in the midst of your trials. Do it as you see the trials approaching. Just turn to God and ask Him for what you understand that you need. And the first step of knowing what to ask God for is having His wisdom dwelling within our life. And so this should be our response. Our response should be to trust God to help us wisely get through the test, so that, as verse 4 ends there, where he says that you may be perfect, you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. That's what our response ultimately needs to be. Turn to God, say, God, give me wisdom. But whatever you lack, go to God and by faith trust Him to minister that into your life, and me, in my case, into my life, and all of us need that God will minister into our lives as He knows what we need. And He is sufficient for that need. If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all men liberally, and upbraideth not, without reproach, and it will be given to him. But ask in faith. So that's our task. Let's pray. Our dear Heavenly Father, I do thank you for this day. I thank you for this time of your word, what it can speak into our lives, and I pray that you will do good things in our lives today. Help us to seek your face for the things we need in the times of our troubles, the times of our tribulations, the times of our trials, that as we turn to you, we would find you truly, completely, and utterly sufficient for our needs. Help us to have the wisdom to know what you will do to work out your will in our lives so that we can be complete in you. Father, do your work. You know our lives. You know the work that needs to be done. Help us to yield to that and to seek your face, to ask you to do the things you want to do in our lives to complete us into your best image bearers. Not just merely sufficient in our humanity and our creation to bear your image, but to bear your image both physically and spiritually in a way that will be a testimony to our world. For those that need to know you as Savior, first of all, draw them to yourself, to your salvation, to your saving grace, so that they can know that, first of all. That is the first step of wisdom. For those of us that are still struggling, trying to become complete in you, Father, help us to ask you for that so that we do truly develop as you want for us to do. This I pray today in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, another week has come and gone, and we thank the Lord for that. So we'll be back with you again next week. Bye just now.